Barakata Yahweh, Barakata Yahushai, by Shem Raka Kodash Barakathon. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh by Shem Yahushai. Double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone who rule and teach well. And peace and salutations to you. I came out there pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the brother Raya with another video. And I'm going to start it off with Isaiah 55 verse 11. So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. And if the spirit of Yahweh by Hashem Yahushai is dealing with you, you can clearly see that these prophecies, these major prophecies, are beginning to come to their fulfillment. Chiefly all these nations being gathered into the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is that Middle Eastern region, and Russia, which is biblically known as Gog, being a guard unto these smaller nations against the United States of America, which is biblically known as Babylon the Great. And in this video, I'm just going to go through Ezekiel chapter 38, the first 7 verses, to just show how these prophecies stated in these verses are coming to their fulfillment. And it's a very beautiful sight to behold. It's just more of an indication that this truly is the truth, and that we're living in the last seconds of the last days. And we know that once Esau, Edom, the so-called white man, mandatorily implements the mark of the beast, which is that microchip implant, that's going to kick off these nuclear missiles flying, as well as Yahushai HaMashiach, whom the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, coming to save the elect of his people and his people only, the children of Israel, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, as well as the confusion of face Israelites, which will come looking as these other nations of people. But let's get into it. This is Ezekiel 38. I'm going to start at verse 1. And the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And as I said at the beginning of the video, Gog is the biblical name for Russia. And you still have people out here that'll say, oh, Gog's not speaking of Russia, or they even do videos that are saying Gog's not Russia. You'll have people that went to, what do they call it, theological school, who have a so-called degree in the Bible, who will say that Gog isn't Russia, and that the Hebrew Israelites, though they like to call us the black Hebrew Israelites, don't know the Bible. But let's see what those imposter Edomite Amalekites over in the land of Israel that call themselves Israelis have to say about Gog, me, and Russia. This is an article from BreakingIsraelNews.com titled, Gog and Magog heating up, Russia clarifies it will side with Iran against the U.S. and Israel. Point blank period. The true men of the Lord, chiefly through GMS, have been pushing out this vibration of these scriptures for so long that these other nations have to acknowledge that what we're saying is the truth. You've got a news website from those fake Israelis clarifying that Gog is the biblical name for Russia. They even have Ezekiel 38 right here. Turn your face towards Gog of the land of Magog. Ezekiel 38 and 1, even though they got that wrong, since Ezekiel 38 and 1 says, and the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying. But also with Gog saying it will side with Iran, that's also a part of prophecy back in Ezekiel 38. Because when we go down to verse 5, it says, Persia, which is the biblical name, which is the original historic name for Iran. And then when we go to verse 7, it says, Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. And Gog, or Russia, is being a guard unto Iran. Russia's chief national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, defended Iran's claims during a trilateral meeting with his Israeli and American counterparts in Jerusalem on Tuesday. He clarified his support for Tehran's accusation against the U.S. and backed their current military presence in Syria, which Israel considers to be a threat to its national security. And once Israel does something to provoke a war with Iran, it's going to drag in all these other nations. It's going to drag in the U.S. on the side of Israel, but it's also going to drag in nations like Russia and China on the side of Iran, which is going to kick off that battle in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, which again is in that Middle Eastern region. They're back in Ezekiel 38. I'm going to go to verse 3. And say, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws. And what this refers to is the Most High putting that old Soviet Union spirit back on these Russians. And to any of you that lived during that time or know the history of the Cold War, Russia was very confrontational with the U.S. during that time. You had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Russians sending their proxy forces and military advisors to train smaller nations that the U.S. was going against. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, Russia pulled back and didn't do that. But as we're getting closer and closer to all hell breaking loose, and these major prophecies come to their fulfillment, the Most High is putting that hook back into their jaws and putting them in that old confrontational Soviet Union spirit, which we can also see is happening in the news. This is a video from Fox News titled, Russia sends a warning to U.S. with armed warship in Cuba. And this is very symbolic because, again, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, where Russia put missile batteries in Cuba aimed at the U.S. in response to the U.S. putting missile batteries in Europe aimed at Russia.
Russia is using its words and its actions to send a warning to the U.S. tonight. Moscow has sent a warship to Cuba and says the U.S. weapons buildup in Europe could spark a repeat of one of the most dangerous conflicts of the Cold War. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin has the story tonight from the Pentagon.
The new state-of-the-art Russian warship received a warm welcome after pulling into Havana Harbor, just 90 miles from Florida, occupying a berth which until a recent travel ban was filled by American tourist cruise ships.
This is a clear show of force by Russia.
Russia's deputy foreign minister warned of a new Cuban missile crisis if the U.S. chooses to deploy
I will put hooks into thy jaws and turn thee back.
Missiles back to Europe after the Trump administration said it plans to pull out of a landmark nuclear arms treaty. Quote, we could find ourselves in a situation where we have a rocket crisis close not just to the crisis of the 1980s, but close to the Caribbean crisis.
The Russians are basically launching a big propaganda campaign at this time, claiming that the United States is acting in a provocative fashion, which is simply not true.
Bullshit. The U.S. is backing Israel and provoking a war with Iran so they can have justification to go to war with Iran.
The arrival in Havana not as menacing as this encounter weeks ago in the Western Pacific when a Russian destroyer harassed the USS Chancellorsville, nearly colliding, forcing the American warship to alter course. Earlier this month, Moscow says one of its fighter jets intercepted a U.S. B-52 bomber in the Black Sea, one of many increasingly aggressive encounters between the two Cold War foes. Back in Havana,
And the American Edomites are saying that what Russia's doing is unfair and provocative. But what did you American Edomites do in Ukraine? You tried to set up a puppet government so you could have a proxy front against Russia.
The arrival of the Admiral Gorshkov, a new class of Russian frigate armed with cruise missiles, signals Russia's intention to project power. Russia's show and tell comes in the wake of a 10,000 NATO troop month-long war game exercise on Russia's doorstep in the Baltic Sea, involving 50 Allied warships.
And they say the U.S. is not being provocative. Complete BS.
And as the Pentagon announced plans to add new low-yield nuclear weapons to ballistic missile submarines, a response to Russia's threat to use limited nuclear weapons on the battlefield. President Trump's new acting defense secretary Mark Esper flew to NATO headquarters today, his second day on the job, for meetings about...
And not just is the Russian government getting back in that old Soviet Union spirit, but the average Russian citizens are as well. This is an article from RT.com titled, Joseph Stalin's approval rating hits historic high. And to any of you that know about Joseph Stalin, you'll know that he's pretty much the face of Soviet Russia. Over 50%, the highest ever of Russians, positively view Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his role in the country's history, a new poll reveals. According to research conducted by the Levada Center, the share of Russians who regard Stalin with respect has grown 12%, while the share of those who perceive the Soviet leader indifferently or negatively decreased by almost 3 times since 2015. I will put hooks into thy jaws and turn thee back. These Russians know that the U.S. is provoking a war with them, and that there is going to be a war, so they're getting in that old spirit again, and are pretty much saying, if you want to have a war, bring it on. As many as 70% consider Stalin's role in the country's history rather positive, praising him for defeating Nazism. Meanwhile, 19% say he played a negative role. It's decreasing. Though 45% of Russians consider the mass repressions during the Stalin era to be unjustified, the number of those who denounce the repressions dropped almost a quarter from 60% in 2008. The Levada study shows that the positive perception of Joseph Stalin increased not only among the Communist Party supporters, who are traditional sympathizers of the Soviet leader, but also among other political groups. According to sociologist Leonid Bryzov, the rising approval rating of the Soviet leader is a sign of a politicization of society, which leads to more radical interpretations of history. Stalin is seen as a champion of the oppressed, he said. This is a purely mythological image, which is a far cry from the real historical figure. But Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua is putting a spirit on these Russians or Gagites to get into that old Soviet Union spirit again. But back in Ezekiel 38, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and will bring thee forth and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords, all their military equipment, such as their fighter jets, their helicopters, their tanks, and especially that S-400 anti-missile defense system down into the Valley of Jehoshaphat for that War of Armageddon. Verse 5, Persia or Iran, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, and Gomer is speaking of Turkey, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. And not only did we see that the Russians are being a guard unto Iran, but they're also being a guard unto Gomer or Turkey as well, by sending them those S-400 anti-missile defense systems. This is another article from RT.com titled, Done Deal. Turkey says it already bought Russian S-400 and U.S. sanctions won't change that. Be thou a guard unto them. Be thou a guard unto Gomer. Nothing the U.S. does will make Turkey abandon its deal with Moscow, or Gog, to purchase S-400 air defense systems, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said, as Washington keeps threatening Ankara with sanctions. The purchase of the Russian-made weapons has long been a point of contention in relations between the two NATO allies. The U.S. has repeatedly threatened Ankara with various punitive measures should they not abandon the deal. It has already canceled training for Turkish pilots, learning to fly American F-35 fighter jets, as well as threatened to kick Turkey out of the multi-billion-dollar fighter jet program altogether. Turkey, however, has stood defiant of U.S. pressure and vowed to retaliate against any U.S. sanctions because they know that they've got Russia behind them. Turkey warns U.S. to think very carefully about going through with its threat. No matter what sanctions decisions, no matter which statement comes from the U.S., we have already bought the S-400, Cavusoglu told journalists on Monday. The only question related to the deal still being discussed is when the air defense systems will be delivered to Turkey, he said. All these nations around the world are starting to wake up to the U.S. is, what's that word I'm looking for? They're starting to wake up to the deceptions and the hypocrisy of the U.S., and they're starting to see that the U.S. isn't really an ally of theirs, so they're looking to other places for protection, chiefly Russia and China. And as I said at the beginning of the video, all this is going to culminate